grassroots driven and community led. However, in the case of Palestine, where there has been a steady, albeit incremental, increase in scholarly and practitioner interest in the language and the work of transitional justice, I've consistently remained dubious and skeptical. Despite this, it is lauded by many others, including leading voices in the fields of international law, those who have no issue with breaking the most basic act of solidarity with the Palestinian people, that of the academic boycott, embedding themselves fulsomely in the bosom of the Israeli Academy. If it is to be anything other than liberal interventionist irrelevance, transitional justice must aim at all times to challenge Zionism's attempt to erase Palestine, not to smooth over the transition through tokenistic processes, such as calling for limited justice interventions devoid of context. In retaining some hope and avoiding throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in the conclusion to the book, I call for a radicalization of the discipline, asking for scholars to be more engaged with challenging settler colonial present-day realities and to pivot transitional justice in pursuit of meaningful decolonization. And though ultimately I shirk a description of what amounts to radicalized transitional justice, that's a limitation, I argue that there must be a fundamental departure from the decades-long peace-building approaches that have only ever been interested in containment and management of the Palestinian people, delineating what is possible as opposed to what is right and just. In arriving at this position, I've had to go through a deep process of unlearning, of undoing years of liberal university education that pumps these ideas, these Western colonial positions into us as uncritical subjects. However, this process was greatly accelerated in 2015 during the most formative moment of my academic career to date, the time I spent with the students in the international law class at Al-Quds University in Palestine, and in considering how any academic can teach international law and transitional justice with a straight face, I'm transported back into the classroom in 2015. And I recall, with a mix of nostalgia and acute embarrassment, one particular interaction I had with a student. As I set about introducing our weekly discussion on truth recovery as justice, I noticed that this student sitting in front of me was visibly distressed, and so I stopped to inquire if she was okay. And she just simply said, "What is the point in any of this? They killed my cousin Hassan last night. The noise you hear outside is the students gathering to remember him. There's no such thing as justice in Palestine." Hassan Albo was one of 3 university students at Al-Quds University murdered during the fall semester, killed by a Zionist settler colonial entity hell-bent on attempted Palestinian erasure, aided and abetted, I argue, by the liberal language and practice of international law and transitional justice. And ever since that day, I have methodically considered this basic question: what is the point in any of all this nonsense? How can you seriously teach the language and promise of transitional justice and international law when every aspect of the supposed protection it affords is being ripped up around you? And to put this another way, in whose interests does international law and transitional justice really serve? In 2021, Palestinian scholar, former professor at Al-Quds University and friend, Nadim Khoury, reflected on this very issue in a chapter he wrote on transitional justice as a form of peace building. And in it he asks 2 simple but very important questions. Whose justice? What transition? What happens when the transitional justice approaches are only focused on serving the interests of the settler colony? What happens when those leading the call for transitional justice are deeply embedded within the bosom of the Israeli Academy, protected by the involvement of useful cheerleaders from the West? What happens when transitional justice and peace-building interventions are promoted and funded by European and American partners, the very governments that are engaging and sponsoring the genocide against the Palestinian people? Their legitimacy when it comes to providing meaningful redress must be consistently and vociferously called out at all times. The book is broken down into 5 chapters, and as anyone who purchases it, I think will see, it is not a long read. It is 109 pages or something. Following an introduction that sets the scene, the book moves to unpack the way that the language of transitional justice has grown and blossomed and emerged and developed since the mid-1990s. I highlight how it has become somewhat of an industry, subsumed, embraced within the United Nations as one of the go-to responses for ending and managing difficult conflicts. I chart its development, giving some case study examples of purported successes, and then show how transitional justice practices in Palestine have actually been hidden in plain sight for some time. In the following chapter, I look more critically at the role of truth recovery after enduring conflict. I show how in the context of Palestine, truth recovery is less about accurate documentation with a view towards justice. Rather, it allows for the facilitation and platforming of settler guilt, allowing for tears after the fact, rather than enforcing accountability and proposing redress. And in borrowing from Shama, these interventions are reflective of the wider settler colonial power relations that determine who remembers, how they remember, and according to whose archives. Next, I move towards understanding and unpacking the role of the International Criminal Court. Rather than being justice-oriented, has in fact been a tool used to individualize and consider issues in isolation. Subject to intense political interference, the ICC has become the supreme example of all siding everything. This was laid so blatantly naked in the recent ICC intervention that brought war crimes charges against Israeli leaders engaged in genocide, while simultaneously charging leaders of the resistance for having the audacity to fight for freedom, as is their legal right and indeed their entitlement. I note how the ICC has never been a tool that offers liberatory potential for a future decolonized Palestine. And the final chapter asks the readers to consider the limitations of transitional justice when it has been completely swallowed up and warmly embraced by the Israeli Academy. I highlight how the discipline has received international inoculation by the involvement of some of the founding voices in the discipline, and show that the locating of the language and practice of peacebuilding in spaces that are responsible for providing the intellectual scaffolding that props up the settler colonial state, there is never any real intention to bring about a meaningful decolonial Palestinian future through this form of intervention. When the inevitable yet painfully distant ceasefire arrives, those silent experts who find speaking up and for Palestine such a moral quandary will no doubt find their voice, providing intellectual hot takes on how to engage in post-conflict reconstruction, how to platform difficult conversations around truth recovery, how to engage in institutional reform, while simultaneously avoiding an awkward engagement with the settler colonial elephant in the room. Speaking out after the fact will be the order of the day for many, and their interventions will mirror all the other bastard versions of liberal peacebuilding, those that have consistently been weaponized and imposed upon a Palestinian population for whom the very concept of peace has long been elusive. Scholars tend to sharpen their pens after the smell of death has dissipated and moral clarity is no longer urgent. The transitional justice entrepreneur stands poised, waiting in the wings to apply for that research grant, to launch their new symposium, and just to ask why can't they all get along. The Israeli Academy, with their useful European and American allies, those who claim to be convinced that the purported last bastion of Israeli liberalism remains, despite a genocide to the contrary, will provide the requisite academic infrastructure. Scholars truly committed to a justice-oriented decolonial future in and for Palestine cannot seek to radicalize a discipline that has revealed itself to be the supreme liberal tool routinely pressed into service for settler colonial conquest. We must avoid engaging in fragmented and tokenistic approaches to colonial peacebuilding, those that seek to isolate, contain, and ultimately silence legitimate and necessary demands for a justice-oriented Palestinian liberation. When the contours of Palestine are being redrawn in blood, and when unconscionable images of starving, injured, and dead children, women, and men have become our daily breakfast, how can any serious scholar give oxygen to a liberal academic exercise that is less focused on a decolonial and liberated Palestine and more interested in smoothing over a difficult and tricky imagined future? It was Malcolm X who told us, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made. Any transitional justice intervention in Palestine, if it is to have any relevance, must consider directly the wounds inflicted by Zionism and its relentless attempt to erase the Palestinian people. Without this, peace building and transitional justice in and for Palestine is little more than pseudo-intellectual gaslighting or just a sick joke. Thank you very much.